So, hello and a very warm welcome to this IED SDCC seminar we have titled Using Past Experiences to Guide Future Development in FCAS and SIDS. Many of the region's poor and most vulnerable live in areas affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. Achieving a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific will require a better understanding of the underlying causes of fragility, conflict, and violence. Now, those of you who are from ADB would know that SDCC published its updated FSA, the FCAS and SIDS approach, on 15th June. Among other sources, the FSA also uses the results of assessments by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department. And today we will discuss how ADB can improve the effectiveness of its operations and achieve its Strategy 2030 objectives in fragile and conflict-affected situations, such as FCAS and Small Island Developing States, SIDS, by using lessons from its past experiences. But before we move ahead with the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Benjamin Graham, who's the advisor at IED. Benjamin will be making a presentation titled Supporting More Effective Development in FCAS in SIDS and What Evaluations Tell Us. Those of you in ADB would know, but those of you who are joining us from outside, I'd like to say that there could be few better placed than Ben to be making this presentation. Ben is from the Marshall Islands, and from 2017 to 19 actually, he served as Chief Secretary of the Marshall Islands, where he also served as Chief Advisor to the President. And of course, at IED, Ben has led and contributed to some major evaluations. So Ben, it's over to you for the presentation now.
Thanks very much for the introduction. So I will quickly run through a few topics, really introducing FCAS and SIDS in the global and ADB context, just to set the frame. And then a quick highlight of what countries we're talking about for those of you who are not familiar with these categories, FCAS and SIDS. And then spend most of the time covering findings from evaluations from the project level as well as higher level evaluation highlights, and then end with some questions that could lead us into the rest of the discussion for this session. So in terms of where FCAS and SIDS sit in the global development landscape and in the ADB context, these countries have been recognized for a long time as unique development cases. By the international development community. SIDS were first formally recognized in 1992 in the UN Rio Declaration. And the concept or classification of FCAS has evolved from earlier concepts such as low-income countries under stress, weakly performing countries, fragile states, fragile situations. The understanding and approaches of these concepts have evolved, matured, and become more harmonized, especially among multilateral development banks. ADB's own charter many years ago already recognized and pledged special regard to the needs of its smaller member states. And more recently, under Strategy 2030, ADB has reaffirmed that it'll continue to differentiate its approaches. And as we have heard from Saleha, the new FCAS and SIDS approach has just recently been launched by ADB. Now, in terms of ADB's operations, there's been substantial growth in the portfolio of projects in FCAS and SIDS. In the years between 2015 and 2019, there was a 54% increase in the portfolio in FCAS and 68% in SIDS. And as we would understand under COVID-19, there's been additional support that's been provided to deal with the pandemic. On the countries themselves, you see here within ADB, there are 16 SIDS and 11 FCAS. And where the circles overlap, you see that there are 8 that are in both groups. And the majority of these are in the Pacific. Now, if you look at IED's evaluations over the years, there are evaluations that have been done covering these countries from different levels, different perspectives. Country evaluations that look at individual country operations and programs of ADB, regional evaluations on the Pacific, there's been a series of those, and then corporate evaluations that also have some coverage of these countries. And then at the bottom there are numerous evaluations at the project level in these countries. And so there's a lot of knowledge there that can be drawn on And so I will summarize in the next few slides some of these findings and lessons. One of the things that you see at the project level very clearly is if you look at the performance of ADB's operations overall, that's the gray line, and you compare it to FCAS and SIDS, there's a very clear historical difference in the performance of projects. This is on a 3-year moving average basis. And you see there the blue line SIDS hovering at around 56% in the last 3 years, and FCAS around 50%. So we can conclude that in ADB, these are the most challenging operating environments. And so it's an important question for us today. Why is that the case, and how can it be improved? One way of looking at the evaluation findings and lessons at a project level is along the project cycle. And here's some highlights. At entry, project design and quality at entry really does matter. Evaluations often find that project designs and the relevance of project designs are often impacted by weak understanding of the underlying development problem, of capacities, of ownership, and of political economy, change, dynamics, and overall risks of projects. On infrastructure projects, there's often a finding of weak project readiness. Once projects are underway, evaluations find often insufficient support in FCAS and SIDS, limited capacity and ownership, weak feedback loops and flexibility during implementation, and a series of unforeseen shocks, natural disasters, political shocks, other types of social shocks. This is especially the case with climate change accelerating on vulnerable states. It's often difficult to get consultants to work in FCAS and SIDS, and that's often a finding in evaluations. And then there's often contracting and procurement issues, as well as high staff turnover, both on the part of government and on the part of ADB. And then finally, when projects complete, sustainability is often weak, again, linked to capacity and support after projects end. There's often limited reflection and learning from projects. With an increasing portfolio, there's pressure on staff to move on quickly with new projects. And again, evaluations find that high staff turnover often affects sustainability of projects. And so here you see that both country and client, as well as ADB factors, affect project level performance. The next couple of slides highlight what we've seen from higher level evaluations in terms of country context, ADB's performance, and how to improve results. In terms of country context, these higher level evaluations identify a whole range of fragilities or fragility dimensions: social, institutional, political, environmental, and capacity related. These are seen sort of irrespective of country levels, and they often prevail regardless of whether countries are even classified as FCAS. These factors are both debilitating and destabilizing, and have worked against long-term sustainable development in these countries. And COVID-19 is a very clear example of a destabilizing variable more recently. A key challenge for development partners and their staff is really understanding the context and identifying where and how to intervene. It's often seen that the law of the instrument prevails, right? So if you're only good or you're good at infrastructure, that's what you focus on, and perhaps not so much on some of the other areas that require attention in FCAS and SIDS. Capacity is almost always a key constraint, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. And over time, these higher level evaluations have identified climate change as a more prominent exacerbating factor in these countries. On ADB support and performance, a key finding is that ADB approaches over the years has evolved, but a stronger institutional focus is needed. And I think that's the main objective of the new FSA, is to embed that further. So on ADB's performance, causes and symptoms of fragility very clearly continue to affect the effectiveness of ADB operations. I already mentioned here that ADB's approaches over the years have shifted on different areas of focus: growth, institution building, poverty reduction, private sector development. There has been some very clear progress made by ADB on differentiating its approaches, on scaling up resources, on putting more people in the field in FCAS and SIDS. But it's still also a finding that ADB often underestimates the prevalence of conflict, including subnational conflict, violence, and political economy, environmental, and capacity risks in some countries. Performance is often held back by insufficient diagnostics at the beginning, and then monitoring and learning feedback loops along the way, as was already mentioned. In more recent years, there's been increasing attention to supporting climate change, but much more will be needed given the pace of change. And again, bottom line, a stronger institutional focus on FCAS is needed. In terms of findings from these evaluations on improving results, the main point here is that improving results will require concerted efforts and progress across multiple fronts. So just some key words here in terms of improving results: better understanding in terms of diagnostics and understanding of the context, more conflict, political economy, and capacity sensitive programming, further differentiating approaches, building on what has already been done, and differentiating not just approaches, but specific areas of operations, as well as capabilities of staff working in these countries. More focus on investment in project preparation and readiness, especially for infrastructure projects. Scaling up FCAS expertise in departments that are dealing with FCAS and SIDS, and tacit country knowledge. And then more active monitoring, reporting, and feedback loops. So those are some immediate things that can be done to improve results. Over the longer term, these evaluations also highlight the importance of really scaling up support for resilience. FCAS and SIDS all face increasing vulnerability to climate change in particular. So that's a longer term investment. And then this issue of capacity, as I said earlier, and let me go to that more detailed on this next slide. So capacity really matters for development effectiveness, obviously, but it is also really difficult to develop, and many evaluations, as well as operational experience, has really shown that to be true. But here are some things that are also observed. Thin capacity of counterparts, especially implementing agencies. This is the most frequently cited factor in unsuccessful ADB operations. More than any other reason, this has come up at the top. Counterpart capacity really impacts the whole cycle, right? From project design, implementation, and the sustainability of projects. So it is a very important dimension to consider. But capacity and institutional development are inherently difficult engagements, as we all know. Sometimes capacity development support is provided, but it's too short term, or it's focused only on implementation support or compliance with ADB requirements. So that's been a finding. Many efforts to build capacity, not just by ADB, but many other partners working in FCAS and SIDS have not succeeded, to be honest. And this has been very frustrating for partners, but there are examples of things that have worked. As we can understand, in many cases in FCAS and SIDS, direct capacity support and supplementation is needed alongside capacity development. That's just the reality on the ground in many of these places. And it's also important to note here as the final point there that if more resources and projects are being provided to these countries without more attention and support for the capacity side, then it's unlikely to work. So that's an important thing to keep in mind going forward. So let me stop with just a few questions to get our discussion going. Can project performance in FCAS and SIDS really improve? Why and how? With ADB and other partners scaling up operations in these countries, what is being done to also improve coordination and the absorption of these resources? Do we need a major rethink in terms of the way not just ADB, but other partners support and build capacity in these countries over the long term? So that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I'll hand it back to you, Saleha.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your presentation. And to the audiences, we will have a designated question and answer session. So please do note your questions. Feel free to ask the panelists, identify yourself, and of course, please identify who you would like to ask these questions to. To the panelists, as I announce your names, please turn your videos on. Today we have Sergio Lugaresi. He's the Executive Director at the Board of Directors. Leah Gutierrez, Director General PARD. Samuel Tumiwa, he's Advisor Conflict Affected Situations at SDCC. Stephan Wegner, he's Senior Evaluation Officer, Expert in Assessment of Aid to FCAS at IEG World Bank Group. And Joanne Asquith, Director at IED. And today's session will be moderated by Marvin Taylor-Dormond, DG IED. So Marvin, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Saleha. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. And more importantly, thank you very much to all of you who are joining us in this seminar. We're talking today, as Ben has put it, but a complex but really important subject for multilateral development banks. A huge proportion, it is estimated that in general in the world, by 2030, 2/3 of the population living under extreme poverty will be living under these conditions. This is sort of the last mile of the effort to support development of our institutions. And it has very specific complexities, as Ben has just put it, based on our evaluation work and also on his own experience. And to talk about this, we have this great panel today. We heard from Ben, but we want to dig in first. This is the plan. We're going to be first digging in and bringing in the perspective of each of our panelists to better understand the nature of the problem. And in a second part of our conversation, we will be talking about solutions. What has to be done? What is being done? What is going on right now to address these very difficult problems of development? And so we're going to start on the first part of digging in by bringing in first Sam, we just heard what Ben said, and you are the lead person in ADB on this subject. But I say that more importantly, you have managed this type of situations. You were the country director in Afghanistan, or the most difficult context to operate in. And so you have your own practical experience about the challenges of operating in this context. Among all the challenges that Ben has just presented, what in your view are the most vexing ones, the more complex ones, and what makes it so unique to work in this context?
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you for having me on this event. Thank you especially for putting this event together so we can discuss it, learn from each other, but also share our experiences. Thank you also, Ben, for framing the issues. I think we're very lucky to have somebody with your insights, and the way you presented it has been very, very good. So appreciate that. You know, I'm the advisor for FCAS, but I did oversee the preparation for the FCAS and SIDS approach. But I'm going to try to talk today, and we coordinate a little bit to talk mainly about the FCAS, and have DG Gutierrez, and she is the Director General for the Pacific, talk more and focus more on answering the SIDS questions. I want to start perhaps by underlying that although we categorize FCAS countries, the 11 FCAS countries, into one group of countries, but in fact, no, we can't see them as one group of countries. It's very important that we really dig down and understand that they're quite different. For example, you have there that are countries in transition, and their fragility comes from this nature of transition. You have Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, who graduated from FCAS and are no longer Group A countries, or countries that are eligible for grant assistance. But after they graduated, they somehow dropped back into being classified as FCAS. And it's important that we look at them and treat them very differently. And then, of course, in that group, there are the small island microstates. You know, these countries are faced with structural challenges such as geographic isolation, narrow economic base, capacity constraints has been talked about, and the vulnerability to natural hazards, especially typhoons. And I think, again, the way we work, the way we approach small island microstates is very important that we categorize them differently. Leah, of course, will talk about the other SIDS. But then there are the countries that are in conflict. You have Afghanistan and Myanmar, and clearly we need to be working very differently in Afghanistan and Myanmar than we do in the small and island microstates. But even within these two countries that are in conflict, their conflict is different. Afghanistan's conflict and Myanmar's conflict are different, and their conflict in both countries are evolving, especially the last maybe few months. You know what's happening in Afghanistan with NATO forces withdrawing and the Taliban reasserting itself, with Myanmar and the military coming into power. So again, they're in conflict, but they're very, very different. And then, of course, Laos is the last country that's on the list, and it's on this list as fragile because of debt distress. So I think it's important, and this is that we really look at them individually and not just say, oh, FCAS, and therefore, because they are an FCAS country, this is how we should work on them. No, we should look at them in each and every one's circumstances and understand them. Ben had talked about this also, the need to really do the diagnostics, the really need to really understand them before we begin to work in them. The other point I want to make, and just briefly so that we can have more time for Q&A, is what we're really proposing, and what the interesting or the vexing or interesting is really about time and resources. What we really need to do in the FCAS countries is really just good development, right? Understanding the situation and tailoring our interventions, our assistance to the local settings. Oftentimes, I think, because of resource constraints, because of time and resources, we have to do things very quickly and get it done, because we have a cycle. We got to do it this year, and next year we got to do next year's, and we got to implement last year's. And it's a luxury that we don't have. So we have to somehow break the cycle and figure it out and figure how we might do this. And I think that is the real crux of the matter. I mean, as a development bank, we're supposed to be the financier. In fact, the government is supposed to be one that identifies the project, does the detailed design. We finance it, and we help supervise and oversee have fiduciary responsibility. But in this case, in the FCAS, and we cannot do that. Clearly, we cannot do that. And we need to have a much more hands-on role and provide not just capacity building, but capacity supplementation. I'll stop there, and so as not to go into too much detail and give us some space to discuss this further. Thank you. Back to you, Marvin.
Thank you very much. Great and succinct perspective of your own experience and of the challenge that you are facing now in leading this subject. And talking about a diverse environment to work with, let me now move to Leah. Precisely, if there's anything that characterizes the Pacific, is diversity in many dimensions, right? And besides that, isolation in many dimensions, many aspects. The points that Sam was talking about increase the dimension, the magnitude of the issues increase there. What are the key issues that, in your own experience running the business, as responsible for running business in the Pacific, what are the key obstacles for building resilience and improving performance in the Pacific that we heard already is quite low, historically low?
Thank you, Marvin. And first of all, I would like to thank you, our IED colleagues, for this highly topical event. There are many MDBs and donors who are actually thinking about the approach to FCAS and SIDS right now. And we are benefiting from analyzing our past experience and taking forward the lessons that we've learned. So moving to your question, we fully agree that the critical end goal for ADB assistance to the Pacific SIDS is to help build resilience in this most challenging environments. And I must say, Ben has really described in his presentation very well. All of these factors that he mentioned in the presentation are something that we consider, we take into consideration very seriously in the Pacific SIDS and also in the AFCA SIDS. And in fact, for the Pacific Department, we are bringing to the board the new Pacific Approach 2021 to 2025 next week. This is designed to guide ADB's support for a resilient Pacific. Now, moving to the obstacles that we're facing, the analytical work behind the Pacific approach identified three key obstacles. The first is actually the high vulnerability of the Pacific to shocks, which Ben also mentioned. Second is weak service delivery. And third is slow growth. In terms of the vulnerability of the Pacific SIDS to shocks, despite the fact that the Pacific SIDS are highly vulnerable to shock, they actually have very limited resources to prepare for and to respond to shocks. And last year, beginning from last year, the COVID pandemic basically laid bare this vulnerability and highlighted the structural challenges faced by the SIDS. And some of these vulnerabilities include, of course, vulnerability, the vulnerability to economic volatility. And this is because of the narrow economic base for many of our SIDS countries, which many are dependent on tourism, some on fisheries. And also there is strong reliance on imports for essential goods, also services. And given the narrow economic base, let's say tourism, fisheries, and also the imports, of course, it's also more exposed to volatility in commodity prices. Next, also mentioned by Ben, is actually the exposure of Pacific SIDS to natural hazards and the impact of climate change. With climate change happening, what we are seeing is the tropical cyclones, which regularly hit the Pacific, is also increasing in intensity, which means greater damages and a longer period for our Pacific SIDS to recover from them. And then, this is coping with the disasters is made more difficult by the fact that there is lack of data, there is uncertainty, there is capacity constraints to react to climate change and the impact of disasters. Next, we've already seen with COVID, vulnerability to health shocks. And I must say that it's not just the COVID that the Pacific is vulnerable to. We've seen the impact of other infectious diseases like measles, the Zika virus, also animal diseases. And animal diseases impact both food supply and biosecurity. And I need not elaborate on capacity constraints. And I also would like to mention that sustainability is a challenge, given the small economic base, which translates to limited capacity to generate revenue, which means a limited fiscal space for that. Okay, so this is another vulnerability. And I would just like to quickly cover weak service delivery. And this is because also of lack of infrastructure. and again, the poor capacity. So these challenges exacerbate unequal access to services, which is most pronounced between outer islands and the urban centers. And last but not the least, the slow growth. The small domestic markets and lack of export opportunities create barriers to private sector growth, leaving it under development and able to widen the economic basis of the SIDS. And then also, of course, we have a significant level of out-migration to larger economies. And then we also have weak education systems, which leave skills gaps in the labor markets. So we really are working at all of this. An ADB specific approach for 2021-2025 is aiming to help not just build back better, but crucially to build the necessary resilience to better respond and recover from future external and internal shocks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. Let me pose a question to you that you may consider for the second half. Does that mean that under these so difficult circumstances, and this also applies to Sam, the bank and MDBs have to necessarily accept low levels of performance, or there is any hope that despite these circumstances, a better performance, development performance of our institutions operating in this region is possible? That's the question that I would leave there for you to reflect for the second half of our exchange. And now, moving on to more lessons, things that we have learned from operating in this context. I'll bring in now Joanne. Joanne, you're the director for thematic and country evaluation. And of course, you have developed a lot of experience looking at different contexts. But you, most importantly, you conducted an evaluation of the ADF, the Asian Development Fund, dedicated to catering to the needs of this type of countries, right? And so most of our FCAS and SIDS are eligible for ADF, and therefore they were the object and subject of your evaluation. What have we learned over the years? What lessons of operating in these very difficult countries that need to be taken into account by our institutions?
Thank you, Marvin. I think it's worth noting that these countries, FCAS and SIDS, are those countries that mainly get grants, and they're funded through the Asian Development Fund. So these are grant countries, and also we're still learning. You know, that because they are difficult context or complex contexts, and these contexts change. Sometimes without warning, they change. So we are all still learning. ADB is still learning. Other MDBs are learning how to operate in these contexts. And that's a good thing, that we continue to learn. And I think that I think it's fair to say that everybody's struggling to figure out how MDBs, how their performance can improve in these contexts. But I'm just going to talk about two things. One is the need for greater understanding of these contexts. And then the other lesson that's been learned actually is that performance can improve with greater presence on the ground, because presence on the ground leads to better understanding of the context, closer working with other donors, and also the ability to respond to risks in a very timely manner. In the past, we learned that because these countries are isolated, we often learn too late that things are going wrong. You know, that midterm reviews don't happen at midterm and so on. So having people on the ground really enables ADB to respond, to risks as they occur. So what is the big deal about understanding the context? Ben described that the context is very different to other countries where ADB works, and Sam also alluded to that. And it's really important to have an understanding of these contexts, because through understanding them, we can change design. We can, ADB talks about a differentiated approach, but it's through understanding the context that you can then design a differentiated approach. And in the evaluation, what we found was that in project documentation, you don't see this understanding of the context coming through. And I think that's because, ADB follows certain templates. So when you submit documents to the board, you're following a template. There's not a great deal of room to describe the context, but this is where we have to change the business processes. The business processes need to be changed, recognizing that we're working in these complex contexts. So more room for demonstrating our understanding of the context, and then how we're working differently as a result of that. And then that needs to be followed through to the project completion stage, so that at project completion, you can go back and look at what did we understand, and how did we then adapt to that understanding, and did it work, so that you can then investigate these things at project completion. Because what we found in the evaluation was that what ADB knew about the context and how ADB worked differently doesn't come through in the project completion report, which makes it very hard to say, well, it was a difficult context, and because of that, ADB worked differently, and it worked for these reasons. And sometimes, even if you don't get the result that you were looking for, there was this adaptation, this learning, this process that went on along the way to recognize that the project was able to move and reshape given this difficult context. So point number one really is just a greater understanding of the context, and using that to design a different approach. So the second thing that I think ADB has learned a lot from is building presence on the ground, and that is something that we can clearly see has happened over the last 10 years. And it's been through partnership with other major players, particularly in the Pacific region, working much more closely with Australia and New Zealand to build presence on the ground. And that has brought so many benefits in terms of responding to risks, working with others, supporting government departments, particularly with economic reform, supporting implementation on the ground, and also just being much more aware of things that are coming up in relation to project implementation. So building field presence has been a key thing. I think there's further to go, but we can talk about that later. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Let's bring now another perspective. We appreciate Stephan Wegner is joining us today from the World Bank, specifically from the independent evaluation group where we used to be colleagues. And Stephan, you have done a good amount of work on this subject. That's why we are interested in listening to you. You have conducted a number of evaluation pieces looking at the work of the World Bank Group, and particularly focusing on private sector. And so my question to you is, what are those key fundamental elements that have to be taken into account when operating in this context, especially with respect to private sector? And so we have not talked about the exacerbated circumstances that COVID has created here, but maybe you can make a point on the subject, because I know that you at the World Bank Group are looking at this specific dimension of the issue, just as in ADB as well. And we are interested in listening to your perspective. Stephan.
Thank you very much, Marvin, and good morning, everyone. Good morning to the panelists and the participants. I'm very happy to be here. Marvin, you asked a lot of questions, so maybe I will just try to be brief and address most of them with highlights, and we can go a bit deeper in the questions and answers. Perhaps let me start with the current environment with COVID-19. Which of course is hitting FCAS countries, that are already, facing all these other myriad of issues particularly hard, right? And especially before the onset of this current pandemic and crisis, FCAS were already facing, increasing challenges, an increase in violent conflicts over the last 10 years or so, the largest forced displacement crisis, over 80 million people currently ever recorded, and reversals that we've seen. Sam referred to those in Myanmar and Afghanistan, but we also see that in other parts of the world, Ethiopia, Mali, Chad, and so on and so forth. COVID now has laid, many of these challenges bare, and it has, of course, health, economic, social, and poverty effects that add to existing vulnerabilities. Meeting under-resourced health systems, some of the issues that Leah and Sam have already referenced, the weak governance capacity to respond to the crisis. And of course, the expectation that many million more people will be pushed back into poverty, in particular in those markets. But more importantly to our discussion today, the effects of COVID may also exacerbate the drivers of fragility. So we've already seen some increase in social strife, in gender-based violence in FCAS countries. And of course, one doesn't need a lot of imagination to imagine the impacts on refugees, on displaced people, during this pandemic. So this all means that the development partners need to focus even more on these high risk, highly challenging, most desperate countries that need our assistance when they design their programs to promote resilient recovery, and prevention of exacerbating fragility drivers that are already present in these markets. Now, turning to the first part of your question, Marvin, of course, the long-term agenda doesn't go away, and it continues. So the long-term challenges that these countries and markets face, they will be even more pronounced once we come out of the COVID crisis. And here, as you said, at the World Bank, we've done quite a bit of work on evaluating the effectiveness of approaches in FCAS countries and also small island states. And we've identified a number of issues that are crucial or critical, even recognizing that this is a group of countries where everything is a priority, everything is lacking. So I will just briefly refer to them, and hopefully we can go a bit more in detail in the questions and answers. I couldn't agree more with Joanne when she said that we are all still learning. We have a limited appreciation of what works. these issues about the heterogeneity of FCAS and SID environments, where really you're dealing with sui generis situations in most of these markets and countries. And this highlights the importance of understanding the drivers of fragility and then building a support program, an assistance program, leveraging drivers of being cognizant of drivers of fragility, but also leveraging opportunities and areas of resilience that one can build on, right? So some of these areas that we've identified, some of them have been mentioned already. One is the importance of strengthening institutions, building the capacity of the state, because that is crucial to delivering services to the population, but also to build legitimacy of the state and trying to overcome these cycles of fragility and distrust. The second is precisely focusing on service delivery, building capacity of citizens, and delivering vital basic services, whether that's education and health services, so important in this current environment, but also infrastructure, power, water, and so on, logistics that are important inputs also for the private sector that you mentioned, Marvin. We also identified then specific support to gender, where we found that women and children were often used as an instrument of conflict and war, and were particularly affected by its effects, by its aftermath, and required some specific assistance through economic empowerment and addressing some of those injustices that have been brought about by the conflict. And then turning to the private sector, which is the fourth bucket that we've identified as important, because livelihoods and jobs, or the lack thereof, are really an important driver of fragility, especially among the young population. And here what we're seeing is that although the private sector is hugely important, to build resilience, to help provide livelihoods to people, and help even provide sustainable development, contribute to sustainable development. The private sector in these countries really faces daunting challenges. The constraints that private companies, private enterprise face in many of these markets are much, much more severe than in other developing countries, starting from uncertainty, weak governance, corruption, to outright conflict, destruction of assets, and so on. And so we really think that this is not a matter of a private sector instruments, a private sector response, of providing access to finance, of providing technical assistance. That is also very important and critical and crucial, including blended finance solutions. But it is really an issue of providing both public and private solutions and support programs to nurture the local private sector, bring in foreign direct investment that can help jumpstart the private sector in these markets. But our conclusion of the effectiveness of private sector solutions in these markets is really that, as Joanne was saying, no one really has the solution. We're still learning by doing, and it requires a lot of experimentation, piloting of new instruments, including the private sector window, with which the World Bank now has some experience.
Thank you.
And continuing to learning by doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephan. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to remind our audience, our participants, that you can submit your questions in the Q&A section there. We'll pick up that question, address them openly to all the panelists, or to any specific panelists that you would like to respond to your question. Please write them down, and we will address them along the way. And now let me bring in the perspective of a board member. Obviously, it's not representing the board. I would not expect that, but it brings a very important perspective. ED Lugaresi, you expressed a keen interest on this subject very recently, and that even motivated us to help you host a short seminar on FCAS and SIDS, which you brought other European parties to discuss the subject. Why are you so interested in the subject? What are your key concerns of what ADB has been doing in this context, in SIDS and FCAS? What do you think of the performance of the bank in this context? Have you seen anything in your time here with us that the bank is doing well, or that is in which it is failing from your board perspective, in things that are doing the bank is doing well that need to be reinforced? ED Lugaresi.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you for the invitation that has provided me with the opportunity to talk on the issue with very interesting, stimulating colleagues from IED, SDCC, board members, Karen, Redina, Phil, colleagues in Bern, and also colleagues in the World Bank office of the Executive Director for Italy and other countries. I want to thank them, but also, of course, the responsibility of what I'm going to say is all mine. My key concern, they are around what I would call 4 C's, and they come out from my basic concern, that is, as one board member, to abandon the approach that sometimes I see we take, the approach that it is a fragile country, it is small and remote, then we have to support it, and toward an approach where we ask ourselves more, what can ADB do to overcome fragility, including smallness and remoteness? That it is true that the condition of fragility often exists irrespective of the income levels, but we note that FCAS and SIDS countries have different economic performance, for example. This is important for ADB because it means that policies, institutions, and capacity do matter. So my 4 C's, my 4 concerns. The first one is conflict prevention. I think that we should do our best to identify and address the risk before the tensions turn into crisis. And this involves ADB to move away from the sector approach and disbursement success indicators toward a larger approach on governance and progress indicator. The second one is climate change. Climate change and environmental damages are clearly triggers of food shortage and conflicts. Recently, according to an indicator that colleagues from the OERM has provided to me, the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Index, which summarized the country's vulnerability to climate change in combination with its readiness to improve resilience, From that index, we can see that Asian FCAS and SIDS are among the most vulnerable countries. The third C is capacity and institutional building. Other before me have touched upon this. I don't need to elaborate too much, but it is important to strengthen the rule of law, good governance, accountability, non-violent conflict resolution. And finally, regional cooperation. Of course, there is no need to say how important is the role of neighbor in conflict-affected countries. But it is important also for small countries. And we have here the experience of the Pacific with a large set, plethora of council, center, facilities, initiatives that provide cooperation, and we should build on that and expand to other situations. Briefly, what is ADB doing well? The presence in the field, as Joanne mentioned. ADB is a trusted partner, and I think that overall the COVID response has demonstrated that ADB can be flexible and fast without compromising too much quality and standard. What can we do better? We can better understand the context and the complexities, so avoid what Ben has called the law of the instrument. And second, address also the subnational situation. Very often, the root causes of consequences of fragility are regional. And with this, I would stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did I understand you well when you said that move away from success rates and address this other dimension? If I did, then maybe we can talk more about that in the second half and get your perspective. That's a interesting, provocative statement. In fact, there is someone who is asking Leah, and I think that also applies to Sam. That how would success look like if things go well? And that's now the subject of our second part of the conversation. We have some questions here that we will come back to them to the different panelists. There is an interesting question to you, Joanne, for you to address. But anyone can refer to them as well, right, on the standards that should be used to measure success or not measure, as ED Lugaresi has indicated. So let us talk about now solutions. We have talked and digged in about the problems. Let us talk about solutions now. And perhaps we can be a little bit briefer this time so that we can accommodate some questions from our panelists, from our audience. Sam, we have an idea of the problems, and you more than have an idea. You have gone through the problems, you understand them well. And there is the good news that there is a new approach that has been just issued by the bank to deal with FCAS and SIDS. The FSA approach is called. You have been the champion of this new paper, this new approach. There was one in 2013 as well. And obviously the bank has been working in this field for a long time. This is not new. So first of all, can you give us just the taste, the headlines of what this approach means? And why is it different from what the bank has done before? And following on this question for Leah, Leah would refer to her own specific region. How would you know that you are succeeding in applying this approach?
Thanks, Marvin. And thanks for the other presentations in framing this issue. And I'll begin very brief as much as I can and try to take this at a higher level without getting into too much detail. Two parts to this question. First is, what is the FSA all about? And then perhaps how is this going to be a bit different, right, than the previous ones? And if the FSA is really about three things. Okay, the first one is about context specificity. I talked about this earlier. Everybody talked about this, and understanding our DMCs and how and our view and what the FSA puts forward is that we need to do this very early in the process so that we understand the context specificity in which we're working as we're doing the diagnostics for the country partnership strategy. We don't do this, we haven't done this in a while, but we need to really do a political economy assessment and really understand not just what the context, but the risks involved there and the political reality in which we are operating. Sometimes, and I think in the past, and I'll be self-critical of my institution, and sometimes we like to dig a hole in the sand and stick our heads in there and act like we're operating in a politically neutral setting. And I think we can't do that anymore. And we have to really, really take that into consideration and be realistic about that. And so in the diagnostics for the country partnership strategy, we are proposing to do a fragility and resilience assessment. And this will be partnered with a governance risk assessment that's already being done. And we should do it together with the same analysis. And this really outlines what the issues are that needs to be addressed in these countries. And this will be this should inform the country partnership strategy. Moving on, every project needs to look at this analysis and address the issues highlighted in this analysis early in the project design, so that in the concept stage of the project, so when the projects are being prepared and the analysis is being done, they can be included in the project and how it's being addressed. I think that's very important. I think also we also, in addition to the national level understanding, we need to understand the local level. Right? We need to understand local level politics. We need to understand traditional power brokering and decision-making processes. So again, this is understanding the context in which we're working. Ben said capacity building is critical, and all of us have said that. And indeed, we try to make this a component of every project in FCAS. But more than that, we really need to do it differently. We used to just throw it, okay, we'll do some trainings for the counterparts, we'll do some capacity. But let's not just do that. Let's really understand, okay, in this, I was talking to the finance minister for the Cook Islands, and he said to me, we have 2 people in my country that can manage FIDIC contracts. So if one goes on maternity leave, I'll have my capacity will be down to 50%. So, and we talked about capacity supplementation, and we need to recognize that that is a reality of something that we need to do. So that's the first part. It's really the context in which we're working. The second thing that we need to do, and we really haven't done a lot of this since 2015, is do a lot more analytical work and knowledge work. Like the title of this event, looking backwards to look forward. We have not looked at how we've done really in the FCAS countries, in SIDS, maybe not in the SIDS, but in FCAS countries, and how we've performed. How have the FCAS countries that graduated 5 years ago, 10 years ago, how have they performed? What did they do differently that allowed them to stay as graduated countries and transition to greater resilience? And others have fallen back to becoming FCAS. Let's look at some analytical work. Let's do some analysis at the different sectors, the transport sector, the energy sector, the social sectors, education, healthcare, and how the projects in those sectors have performed, and look at trends, look at longer term trends to see how we can improve our operations. So we have to do a lot more analytical work. We have to bring in knowledge, the international best practices and what people are doing in Africa, what our colleagues are doing in Central America, and amongst the MDBs, amongst the bilaterals, what governments are doing, and bring that to ADB. I think that's very important. We really need to put in a rigorous monitoring and evaluation system so that we have a feedback loop. And so that our colleagues in IED and others can evaluate us. If we, I think we had promised in 2013 to put in such a system, but I don't think we did it. So this time we will really have to do that. We have a very rigorous set of indicators that came up with the FSA. And I think this is a key part. We don't know how we're going to do unless we have set measures and we measure ourselves against these goals. So I think that's important. And finally, it's about us identifying flexibilities in our business processes without compromising their integrity. So many of you know that we are looking at redoing or revising or updating our safeguards policies. Well, within that process, we're looking at how we might do our safeguard policies in FCAS and SIDS. We're looking at procurements and doing a guidance note and looking at how we might operate differently in these countries. And so that's the third part. Now, how will it be different and how will it be successful this time? And I think there really is no magic formula. As I said earlier, it's really about promoting good development. But it is really about managing institutional change. And there are a lot of theories about managing institutional change. But mostly for me, it's about bringing the institution along, right? So we have done the FSA in a very consultative and iterative manner. We've had many consultations internally and externally. We had working groups working on this. We've brought in all the departments, the operational departments, the support departments. And I think we have a lot more people aware of this. And so I think that's very, very important. We need to capture the innovations that are taking place and create champions that are doing FCAS. Just maybe as an example, in 2005, the ADB president said that he wanted to increase ADB's lending in clean energy from whatever we were doing to $1 billion a year by 2008. And I was chosen to lead a task force to meet that goal. And I think it was similar at the time. Well, I think it was worse. So I had a meeting with all the energy sector directors, and they said, Sam, this renewable energy stuff, this is all still research and development. This is not what ADB does. We do baseload power, we do transmission and distribution. And to change that mindset to do renewable energy efficiency took a big effort. And I think it's going to be the same way. I don't think it's going to be as bad, but I think it's going to, we need to change the way we think and the way we look at our operations in FCAS and SIDS. And like ED Lugaresi says, that type of thinking is what needs to be done. I think one more point that we had consultations with Leah and her team. They said perhaps the goals for all FCAS and SIDS need to be changed altogether very differently. So I think we need to be quite creative and be idealistic in what we're doing. Over back to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. We gave you a little bit more time because again, you are the one who are putting on the table the expectations going forward. Our next panelists I trust that you can respond to what you have put on the table. And let me first bring in Leah. What are the challenges to implement what Sam has said in the Pacific? What are you going to do with that? And as someone asked you, how would you conceive success? Although ED Lugaresi, it would be good if you react to that too. It says that let's forget about success. Let's focus on capacity, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you very much, Marvin. Okay, yeah, in preparing the FSA, the new FSA, definitely there was a very good consultation and collaboration between SDCC and PART. And moving forward, we really are looking forward to a very strong one ADB effort to implement this approach. As what was said earlier, definitely to implement this, what Sam was saying is that we need implementing the FSA requires a different way of thinking and operating compared to the traditional ADB support to our DFCs. And that means that we really need to think about the way we approach capacity building. So it's not just a simple capacity building. This needs to be actually over a longer period of time. And again, as Sam has said, and what Ben has also said in his presentation, the concept of capacity supplementation, whereby it will not just be capacity building, but we may even have to come in and help our governments fill in some of the capacity gaps in the short term, and maybe intermittently, and maybe even over a longer period of time. I think we need to think flexibly about this concept of capacity. At the same time, we do have to think about a more longer term way of building capacity, because whether we like it or not, there will be turnover with our government counterparts. That's in every country that I've worked in. This is something that I've seen. In other countries, it's actually more regular, every 3 years. In the Pacific, not quite, which is good. But then there are other pull factors, I must say. Next is there is for this to actually succeed, we need sustained resources. And in the case of the Pacific, we have resources on the ground. We have resources in HQ, and it's complemented by other resources coming from our bilateral partners from Australia and New Zealand. And we have, and from ADB, we've been recipients of TASF. Now, in implementing a differentiated approach, not only do we need greater understanding by our staff in the Pacific, but it also requires greater understanding of the context and the situations by staff in other departments, that influence the procedures and the policies related to FCAS and SIDS. Now, so for us moving forward, how would success look like? For me, I go back to some of the criteria, in fact, that IED uses in measuring success, and this is for us to be continually relevant. That is greater understanding of the context and actually working with our governments in addressing their specific challenges. How can that relevance? Number two is effectiveness. For us, in being more effective means that we are going to be able to provide better solutions. And as what ED Lugaresi did say, how can we help our member governments overcome fragility? So that particular effectiveness. And then also that criterion of sustainability. Whatever we put in there as assistance, be it projects, be it programs, be it systems, how can we actually help the sustainability? In the case of the Pacific, I know that this will take longer given the turnover, the lower capacity, and also because of the smaller population. We're talking about very smaller populations here. As Sam did say, in the Cook Islands, it's a capacity of 2. When one goes on maternity leave, there goes half of the capacity. So we have to be understanding of those limits of capacity when we think about sustainability. So when we actually present in the DMFs sustainability indicators that seem to be quite incredible, let us take into consideration the context of the countries that we are working in. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Leah. Or even worse, as I believe is Dave Hill, who was referring to a more complex problem of keeping the people who the bank has helped and the different institutions have helped develop, keeping them in the country. Of course, that happens in large countries, but you say, look at the context. If that happens in one of our island states, well, it's half the capacity or the entire capacity of the country that has left. It's a difficult issue, and I'll bring now Joanne. Everyone has talked about capacity, and that was precisely one of the issues that you touch upon too in your evaluation. What do you think about this new approach and the challenges that the bank will be facing and how they're being addressed by this new approach? Let's try to be brief now to see if we make it to the end, in perhaps a little statement from everyone at the very end. Okay.
Thanks, Marvin. I can be very brief. One of the things I really like about the FSA and the new approach is that capacity is seen as a two-way thing. It's not just the countries that we're working in, it's also ADB's capacity to work in these countries and training staff, not just in the Pacific Department and CWRD that covers Afghanistan and other regional departments. You know, it's across the bank. And Leah said it's a one ADB thing. So this training would be across the bank. I saw quite large numbers of people you're aiming to train. And I would say that it needs to be part of ADB's regular training toolkit. So it's not just a one-off. It's not that we train 100 people this year and then that's it. It needs to be every year, because some of the skills that you will learn about working in these countries will also be very valuable for the other countries that aren't small and aren't fragile. So I did really appreciate that about the FSA, that it's about ADB capacity and building the capacity of staff. So that's good. You know, this whole issue about building capacity is so complex. I mean, you could ask, is it even possible to build a state, to do state building in countries where there are 12,000 people, where the population is 12,000 people? I mean, most of those will be children and old people. So it's a long-term challenge. It needs to start, you know, in education. It needs to, in larger Pacific countries, it also needs to be focused on the universities. It needs to go beyond the departments that we're working with. It needs to be joined up with other donors. I mean, state building takes hundreds of years. So it is complex. There's also the other issue, which is building capacity to implement projects. And that's a whole separate area again. You know, do you do that project by project, or do you build a hub in the Pacific that can deal with several projects? And I'll stop there because I know we're running short of time, but it's a huge, building capacity is a huge area on its own.
No doubt, no doubt. I see that ED Lugaresi, before I continue saying, has made a clarification. He was talking about disbursement in approvals and so on. I suppose what he was talking about is, let's not focus on inputs, but on the development results, as he is pointing out there. I'll give him the floor in a moment. He's closing here and he will clarify it, but this is an important point that he's made. More focus on governance and other qualitative dimensions of progress. And I will now bring Stephan. What do you think of what you have heard based on your experience from World Bank, MIGA, IFC? What do you think of this new approach? Any suggestions that based on this experience you would put on the table as well?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marvin. And I agree with a lot of the things that have been said about capacity building, all of the needs in these countries on M&E, and so on and so forth. I mean, one thing that I heard not too much about today is on prevention. which ED Lugaresi raised. And I wonder if this is an objective for ADB also to be fleshed out going forward. And then I wanted to come back to another point, which is on incentives. And this really echoes what Sam and others, most of you have been saying today, which is about, this is about organizational change, right? And how can we set the incentives so staff will actually want to work on these very difficult countries where projects take 7 years to structure and to design, are more likely to fail, you know, are very remote perhaps. And how is this going to be taken up by the staff appraisal system, by the monitoring and evaluation system? Here, I just want to add one short point on the M&E and what does it mean to be successful in these countries. So I think, as some of you have already referenced, I mean, I think the relevance question, right? Are we doing the right things in these countries becomes so much more important than are we doing things right? So in that sense, I would actually side with those that have been saying, you know, perhaps the outcome ratings that we assign at the end of the day are less important, at least at the situation where we are right now, right? Where we want to scale up, we want to experiment, we want staff to take risks, and we don't want to punish them when they do that. And we are actually now doing some work with our within the World Bank Group to bring out those things in the relevance assessment, as well as strengthening the assessment of bank performance. So to emphasize those elements that require more work, require more contextualization over the outcome ratings. They don't go away, but we are strengthening other elements. Marvin, I saw one question on private sector, which I could answer, but maybe we go first to complete the round and then I can come back.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephan. Very, very, very useful. The point of incentives is a crucial one. There's no doubt. Let me now bring again ED Lugaresi. Of course, you were very involved in the consultation process for the new approach. And so what do you think about this new approach, the FSA approach? What are your expectations as a board member on the implementation of this approach, medium, long term? Is there any expectation, more immediate expectation, not only long term, on your mind? And we get it absolutely clear. We get your point now. That is, you are insisting in quality, not quantity, right? And so, ED Lugaresi.
Thank you, Marvin. The revision has been welcome, and we received very good comments. I think that most of us, or all of us, appreciated the context specificity and multidimensionality as crucial issues. We would like to stress, although also even more, the need to focus on specific and multidimensional drivers of fragility. What are my expectations? Again, 3 C's, competencies, commitment, and coordination. Competencies is regards resources, but resources we would like again to stress the importance of the quality of resources. So competencies are needed, not just a number of colleagues working on the issue. Competency, particularly in diagnostic, political economy, it is mentioned, and in monitoring. And as Joanne already mentioned, we need to enhance, to improve even more our presence in the field. Management commitment, I would expect regional department to embrace and implement the approach, more focused engagement with TMCs, the approach integrated into projects. As I said, the result framework implemented, so away from disbursement indicators to outcome indicators. And, we can look at indicators of governance, public trust, social cohesion, and so on. And finally, I would suggest regular updates to the board to inform of the implementation strategy in a very candid manner, success, but also failures. And finally, coordination with other institutions. The fragility has several dimensions: humanitarian development, private sector, and so on. No institution can deal alone with this issue, and we need to deal with them together.
Absolutely clear.
On the short term, very briefly, the short term flexibility again in responding to the COVID, and we have seen some new challenges. For example, in Afghanistan, where we need to achieve the result of vaccinating the population, but to achieve that, we cannot rely on the government. We have to work with UNICEF, with the local leaders, and this, of course, is aggravating one of the sources of conflict and fragility, that is central government weakness and power of the tribes' heads. Over, thank you.
Thank you very much, very clear. I think our colleagues and everyone, us definitely have heard it clear about these expectations of yours as a board member. I'm sure that has an echo on the rest of the board members. We have just a few minutes to close. A 20-second line that anyone would like to share. I know that Sam wants to share in 30-second a page, so we'll give him that last chance there. Anyone with a line that you would like to leave our esteemed audience with?
One ADB, working together and better understanding and partnering.
Here, here.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephan?
I'll just raise two issues very broadly. One is, for including private sector development, really a focus on bankable projects seems to be the most important constraint, rather than access to finance, from development institutions, and to consider the risk, the trade-off between taking risks and development impacts. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Thank you so much for joining us. Sam?
Yeah, colleagues, if you, the colleagues who are with ADB, this is, we've launched the new FCAS community site, where we share our knowledge, the latest things that we're doing, some best practices, and later we'll be doing some policy briefs or issue briefs here. So if you'd like to access this, you can find it. There's a QR code, and we can do a screenshot of this. And the next one for you, if you're interested, this is a copy of the FCAS and SIDS approach. It was, of course, approved by the president in late April, shared by at the annual meeting, but the printed copy or the laid out copy was launched last week, and you can find a copy of this here from this QR code. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thank you. A great effort. Joanne?
I would say, Marvin, that we don't need a different evaluation approach in FCAS and SIDS. What we need is to see, or be able to see, how differently ADB is working in those contexts, and that would then help to frame how we consider success, so that it's not just about the end point. It's how we also got there, and the risks that were taken and the experiments that were undertaken.
Thank you for capturing that point. Very important, and clarifying that. No different approach. It's tolerance of different levels of success as defined by Leah. ED Lugaresi.
I can only thank you for the very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much. Not with any intention of summarizing, but we heard a lot about don't treat this group of countries as one block. They're very different, each one of them. Make sure that there's a differentiated approach, not as a group, but also individually. We heard a lot about vulnerability. We heard a lot about capacity. Capacity is fundamental if we want to get different results. We heard about the need not to focus on inputs, as ED Lugaresi clarified, but on success development results, success in terms of better governance, in terms of better services, in terms of better regional integration. We heard that there's no magic formula for success, that we got to be realistic, and we learn along the way, but the commitment has to be there, that private sector requires a specific attention by the bank, and that there is hope with the application of the new approach that the bank has put in place. And with this, we conclude our session. We thank the panelists. A big round of applause to them. Great panel. And thank you all very much to our esteemed audience for joining us this afternoon, morning, or evening for some of us. We appreciate it very, very much. We see you at our next event of IED. Thank you so much to everyone.